All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from. We're really excited to get this month's edition of Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series started. My name is Brian Sharp with Safety Chain Software, and first and foremost, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We had, I think, record registration for this, over 1,500 people registered, which is really, really exciting. I think that also points to both the great presenter that we have today, Jeff Strout, whom I'll be introducing here in a moment, from Merieux NutriSciences, and but I think the topic is one we hear a lot about, both on the technology side here and obviously on the consulting and auditing side. This is a big one for all of you. So we're going to be talking today about the magic of internal audits, and Jeff's going to be sharing right from the trenches mistakes, insights, and advice from the experts. And so we're really grateful to have all of you carve out some time in your very busy days to join us. I think you're going to be excited to see all the content coming your way. And with that, we're gonna dive right in here. We know we've got a lot of new faces here today, so we're excited to have so many of you check us out for the first time. Just a real brief background on the series here. We've been doing training webinars for years. But they were more regulatory and compliance related, and the feedback we got was looking for a little bit more tactical, more strategic type of approaches. And so we've built this series over the last couple of years for our community called Beyond Compliance, and we have the opportunity to bring in experts like Jeff to share what they're doing out in companies across the country. So you'll hear a little bit about strategy, a little bit about technology and best practices, some tips and tools, but the idea here is that you can take away something very tangible that hopefully all of you can apply in your plants and facilities around your organization. So we do these for you, and we certainly welcome your ideas around topics and presenters, and we're really glad you're here. And if you keep coming, we'll keep putting them on. So thanks for checking us out this month here. As I mentioned, this is a series we've put on for quite a while. So as the sponsor, this is something that we are very proud of and want to continue to support. There's so many of you doing such great work out there. So a lot of the presenters we have come in will share their thought leadership and their strategies. We're more on the technology side. So at Safety Chain, if you're not familiar with us, we are a cloud-based food quality management system. So we're really helping you drive yield and productivity and compliance, really from receiving to ship out. And so we have modules for food safety, QA, supplier compliance, OEE, production, and a whole lot more. So if you're looking for a way to support some of the things you're going to be hearing about today from the digital side, from the technology side, we certainly would love an opportunity to hear what you're up to and how we might be able to help you out. And you can learn more over at our website there. A few little housekeeping tips as we get started here. These are designed to be conversational. So one of the things we always encourage you to do are ask questions. We happen to have a professional trainer here today, which is kind of cool. But there's a lot of great content that you'll be able to take away. But feel free to fire away questions. We are going to save those for the end. But I have spoken with Jeff ahead of time. He's kind enough to not only share the slides with all of you, so that you can obviously check them later, but also the recording. And if we don't get to all the questions, which given the size of our audience today is quite likely, we will make sure that he follows up with you or someone from his team offline after the webinar. So we'll do our best to get to the ones that are most applicable for everybody, but likely won't get to all of them. So hang in there with us. We'll do our best. You'll notice that just the panelists are displayed. So if you do send a question, it's not getting broadcast to everybody. It's just coming over to myself, Jeff, and our team here. And one of the common questions we get right out of the gate, I'll try and answer, is yes, we are recording this, and yes, we'll be sharing both the link and the slides as I mentioned. And I appreciate Jeff and Merieux's partnership in this and willing to share some awesome content. We usually get those out in the next couple days or so. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, we are on a live webinar through GoToWebinar. We have a lot of people, with hundreds and hundreds of people on here live right now. So if there are any audio issues or anything like that, please feel free to use the chat box, and our team will do our best to help you out. You can join both by the web or by phone. If you're having an issue with one, sometimes just swapping over helps. And I'll also note, because of the load on the system, there's so many people here today, there might be a bit of a latency, so hang in there. Sometimes it takes a moment for the slides to catch up, a couple, 2-3 seconds. It's a good problem. We're glad you're here, and we're going to go ahead and get started now. So with that, I'm going to introduce the man of the hour. I think someone dubbed him the rock star on LinkedIn, we were just joking about, but we're excited to have you. So first, Jeff, can you hear me? Are you online here with us?
Yes, I am. I can hear you.
All right. Well, I am sure many of you have either had training with Jeff, have seen him speak, or read some of his work, but I'm going to make sure to share a quick intro about him. Jeff Strout is an acclaimed FSQA educator and consultant who delivers public, private, and customized short courses for clients throughout the world and for every facet of the supply chain. Today, you're being led by an expert. He's performed by over 7,000 food safety and quality audits over the past 42 years. So he's probably seen just about everything that could happen out there. Some good stories, I'm sure. In addition to food safety and sanitation audits, Jeff's also an expert in HACCP development and training, SQF, sanitation, laboratory and QA training, root cause analysis, food defense, crisis management, preventative controls, and a whole lot more. In addition to winning an SQF Trainer of the Year award, Jeff has more credentials than could possibly fit in his bio here. So I'd encourage you to check him out on the Merieux website, and we'll include a link to that in our follow-up email with the slides, as well as LinkedIn page to see all his credentials and background is quite impressive. But with that, Jeff, we are so excited to have you. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and let you dig in, my friend.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Make sure I've got control here.
Yep.
Okay. So, as he mentioned, I've got over 7,000 audits behind me, and I've seen pretty much everything. So I wanted to take this hour and try to cram it full of all kinds of wonderful facts and advice and some mistakes that I've seen over the years. So this is kind of the agenda. I'm going to go over kind of the need and what the driving requirements are for internal audits. And as I go through each of these areas, I'm going to kind of explain how some companies may fall short in some of those areas. And then at the end, of course, I'll give you the advice and tips. But the drivers for it, the selecting and training of auditors and making sure you have the right people. I'll go over some of the common mistakes that I see because, when you've done over 7,000 audits, you've reviewed a lot of internal audits. And then we'll talk about how to manage an internal audit system. And again, some of the shortcomings and pitfalls that some companies have with managing their system. I'll have a section on just lots of good advice and tips on how to improve your system and improve your entire organization, and then a few best practices in there. So that's kind of our agenda for our remaining time. The one thing that I've noticed over the years that a lot of companies do not really follow the ISO standard 19011, 2018, which is the current standard, for how to do and set up and manage an internal audit system. In it, it's got some great methods of how to perform an audit, how to establish the audit system, how to set up a monitoring for it, reviewing it, how to actually report it and get the information back up through the leadership, get the information back out to the departments and sections and the people that need to have it, performing the follow-up. And then one area that's the Global Food Safety Initiative is focused on, and the FDA and USDA are focusing on, is auditor competence. Are they really well-trained? Do they have the competency to perform that internal audit? So there's some good standards in that 19011 on it. And then a lot of companies also don't have a good evaluation system for their internal auditors with that feedback loop to actually improve them as an internal auditor. So that's all set up in that ISO standard. So that should be the foundation of your program. So the needs for having it, of course, the number one need is your customers. They want you to find your issues and get them fixed. They don't want your issues coming to them. So, making sure you've got all your customer-specific requirements in there is important. The regulators, FDA, USDA, or CFIA, they all have an expectation that you have an internal auditing system so that you have continuous improvement, so that you're making a safe product that's going out the door. If you're GFSI certified, SQF, BRC, FSSC 22000, or IFS, or Primus, you have a requirement for that certification to have an internal audit system. But the key there is it has to be an effective internal audit system. And then, of course, there's the moral obligation. The consumer wants you to find all the issues so that they don't find, the contamination in the product. Another very important driver that a lot of companies tend to miss is the internal audit is a fantastic management tool for the entire organization. You're the eyes and ears for senior management. Give me the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the bottom line is we really want to make sure we have good systems that are effective so we don't have illness and we don't have recalls, because that is really bad for business. So those are the drivers. As we get into the actual audit setup itself, we need to make sure we've got good coverage of all the different criteria, the requirements for the audit. In the olden days, they used to just walk around with a blank piece of paper and say, oh, that needs to be painted. You need to wear your hairnet properly. You're not washing your hands right. And there was no really established criteria. Many companies today use their GFSI checklist, and that's what they start with. But then they often forget they also need to have the requirements of all the laws. One question that I would ask as a auditor walking out onto the floor, I would ask, who's responsible for making this product? And a production supervisor would raise their hand reluctantly and basically say, I am. And I'd say, my question is do you know what laws you have to follow in making this particular product? And of course, the old answer is, I don't know. And I find it very odd that most people don't understand what the laws are that they have to follow out on the floor. So to make sure all the laws are covered in your internal audit, to make sure that your system is working the way it's supposed to, it should all be in there. So part of the law is that you have a food safety plan, whether it's HACCP-based or whether it's preventive controls-based under FDA. Do you have the right critical control points or preventive controls? Are you looking at how effective they are? Do you have a good quality system? And I'll talk more about the quality piece a little bit later on. And then you also need to look at your packaging. Is it designed right? Do we receive it right? Is it printed right on it? Do we store it correctly? And put it on the machine correctly? Look at it through the entire process. Our people, a lot of times internal auditors, they should be standing in an area watching what's going on in production. And everybody knows you're there as an internal auditor, so they're going to modify their behavior for about up to 25 minutes. So as an auditor, you should really stand there for 45 minutes to an hour, because after 25 minutes, you become background noise. Then you get to see their real habits. I can't tell you the number of times that a quality manager, or a production manager, or a general manager would say, I didn't know they did that. Well, that's mainly because you're only out here for 10 to 15 minutes, and then you move on to something else, and they've modified their behavior for you. So you want to make sure that your internal auditors are spending the right amount of time so that they understand the real habits of the people. And there's lots of prerequisite programs that you need to make sure that you're taking care of and that they're effective, such as, accuracy checks, calibration of your thermometers and pH meters and scales and those kinds of things. And then the best, I would say the most important job in an entire facility is the person who does sanitation. There is a law that says it in order to do production, it must be clean. There is no law that says you must produce. So that's where I come from, that sanitation is the most important job. So a big part of your internal audit should be evaluating, do we have the right sanitation? Are we doing it at the right frequency? Are we cleaning more often than we need to, wasting money, wasting chemical, the heating of the water or whatever? Or are we not cleaning enough? And it should be tied in with your environmental monitoring data, so that way you know how often it takes to get dirty to where we can actually have the right sanitation. Do we have the right chemicals? Are they scientifically built for the soils we have, and which is the food items that you're making, the food contact surfaces, because there are some that will destroy your equipment. And if you have hard water, do they have a chelating agent? Those kinds of things. So you want to be able to ask a lot of questions and dig deep into all of your prerequisite programs. Another one that's very important is the approved supplier program. How's our connection with our suppliers and your purchasing people and your R&D folks? Who's evaluating that connection? And do we state the right requirements in our specifications so that we're getting the best possible product in? And I'll talk more about how that ties in a little bit. So a lot of other programs, and I'm not going to go through all of these, I'll just highlight a few of them, but your maintenance program, things like, do we know the shelf life of our equipment? And how are we doing on that shelf life? Are we destroying that equipment with the way we're setting it up, the way we're cleaning it, the way we're maintaining it? Is it causing a risk to our product because of the way we treat it and deal with it and things? Water safety, are we testing the water on site? Do we have a good water source? Do we get the good test results in a timely manner from the city or county or whoever? Do we have a good stock rotation program? That's first in, first out, first expired, first out. And then pest control. The one issue that I've really found with pest control is most companies have not really identified the target pest for that area. They just assume that the local contractor, in whatever program they have, which is usually rodent control, insect control, or flying insects, and then maybe stored product pest. But if you want to control birds, that's an extra cost, and they'll put up the spikes out there, they'll put up the owl that makes ooh ooh, and it's a fake owl, so in 2 weeks the other birds are sitting on it, doing their business on it. But you got to make sure you understand what the target pest is. I've seen skunks, raccoons, beehives. I've seen bats get into a facility, and it's against the law to kill a bat. And it could be up to, at least here in the United States, it could be up to $10,000 fine. So you don't want to kill a bat. You want to get the local health department involved. Or, yes, in all the 50 states, there is a bat control. And those are the two entities that legally can kill a bat to test it for rabies. Moving on to foreign material control, do you know all the sources of your foreign material? Metal, plastic, wood? Is the metal or foreign material coming from your supplier, or is it coming from your equipment that's starting to self-destruct? And those things. So you can look those up, and I could go into that in great depth, but don't have time here. Allergen management is another program to make sure you've got all the different issues that are associated with managing all of your allergens that you potentially have. One of the things I found over the past couple of years at a lot of places is they'll have a box of gloves out on the line, and people are, digging their hands in and getting the gloves and pulling them out. And sometimes the way they're working, allergens may fall into that box of gloves. And then when they go to clean, they pull the gloves off the line, clean everything, and then put the gloves right back on, which you may have a different allergen being run at that time, and you may be cross-contacting allergens. Just some FYI there, but make sure all those requirements for your allergens and your allergen program is built into your internal audit. Make sure you have a good business continuity program, crisis management plan, food defense plan, Make sure that you test the system, or challenge it, or however the terms are in your GFSI audit. But typically a tabletop exercise will work as long as it interacts with all the different departments. You need to ask questions of the people on the team, and if you were to have an event right now, would you really be ready for it? Communication is an issue, with somebody watching social media during that time. Food defense, the FDA has the new rules out, part of FSMA, and the large companies had to be compliant last July. Medium companies have to be compliant this coming July, and then small companies have one more year after that. But you want to build those requirements into your internal audit to make sure your company is on its way for compliance. You need to make sure you have a good identification of your product through your system, good traceability, good recallability, good transportation system. FSMA has a new safe transport of food rule. You want to take those requirements, and if you're a shipper that ships out to a distribution center of a ready-to-eat product, for instance, or an ingredient that goes to another manufacturer, you're deemed the shipper. So you want to make sure that you have prior load logs on those trailers as they're empty. Make sure that it won't contaminate your product like a wooden sidewall, and I'm getting ready to put on super sacks of flour, and you don't want the forklift driver to scrape that super sack against that wooden sidewall to where splinters get into it. So they would have to put up a barrier in between. You want to make sure the trailer is good and clean, but make sure those requirements are built into it. And then you want to evaluate your training program from orientation all the way through to refresher training. And do we have the right messages? Is what's in the SOP, is what's in the law, what's in our GFSI audit scheme, and what's actually in our training documents all aligned? Are they all going in the same direction, so to speak? And then, of course, you also want to look at waste management. Some of the other things you need to really be concerned about is, do I have the right people on the team? Do I have members from all the different departments, operations, maintenance, engineering, QA, warehouse, shipping, human resources, sales and marketing? It's nice to have a big diverse group or pool of people, but you also need the right person. A lot of times when I teach the class, and somebody will tell me, I've been building this program for years and years, and that's my baby. I'm sure all of you have heard that out there. As an internal auditor, you have to be willing to tell them their baby's ugly. You've been doing it wrong for 20 years, and here's why. So you have to be willing to ask a lot of questions. You have to be willing to call it like you see it. So if you're not willing to ask questions, you're not willing to call it like you see it, maybe you don't need to be an internal auditor. Another thing is your team has certain responsibilities, and you have responsibilities if you're managing the program to those auditors. They need to make sure that they're auditing areas that they're not responsible for, because you want to make sure they're going into a different area. The auditors need to be trained on all the criteria. They need to know what the requirements are. They also need to understand what your procedures are for your company. Make sure they're thoroughly prepared. They've got all the tools. I used to have an audit toolkit with everything in it that I could possibly need. They have to carry out their audits, and they have to report the audit the way your procedures describe to report. And then, of course, there's follow-up. So selecting an auditor, they need to have a basic understanding of what you do in that facility. They need to have the requirements or the criteria. If not, you need to provide that to them. But they also need to understand the biological hazards. So they need to understand what's in the hazard analysis. Those biological, chemical, physical, or radiological hazards. And if they need more information, you're going to have to get some training for them. Certain skills auditors should have. They have to have integrity. Being able to call it like you see it, stick to it, be trustworthy, be ethical, be fair, be open-minded. Sometimes you have to be a diplomat. You have to be sympathetic. Sometimes people might be having a bad day. You don't want to just pile on. So you want to be very observant, You want to be versatile, self-reliant, because in some cases you're going to be working out there by yourself doing that audit. You have to be willing to make a decision. Is that a non-conformance or not? And you have to base it on something. Anytime you call it a non-conformance, you have to be able to state exactly what you are not in compliance with. Here's the law that you're not in compliance with. Here's the GFSI requirement you're not in compliance with. Here's the SOP or the customer requirement you're not in compliance with. You as an auditor need to be a professional in every sense of the way, in your appearance, in your punctuality. If you say you're going to interview somebody in a section at 9 o'clock in the morning, make sure you're there at 9 o'clock in the morning, because people's time is valuable. Mind your manners. Make sure you're prepared. You've got everything you need. You know, if you need that little tablet to, take notes on, or you need swabs to take swabs, you need safety vests, safety glasses, whatever, make sure you have everything. And then make sure that they put forth the effort and the time to actually do a good, thorough due diligence on the internal audit. Focus on the audit, not on your normal job. You're going to need support from your supervisors to make sure you're actually allowed to spend the time to do a good job on that internal audit. They have to keep confidentiality. No conflict of interest. So you shouldn't be auditing an area that you just came out of and you built all their programs. That would be a conflict of interest. Make sure there's no unsafe activities. If you're not familiar with a piece of equipment, have the people in that area open up that piece of equipment. And somebody's moving okay, here we are. Again, it's jumping around there, not sure why.
Should be
observation of unethical behaviors. Any unethical, report it like you see it, but make sure that there is no unethical activities going on. All right.
Yeah, it seems to be bouncing there. Not sure what's going on.
I don't know why it's bouncing, but
yeah, it should be good there.
Let's get into the mistakes. A lot of the big mistakes I've seen is people not assigning a dollar value to it. One of the most important things that senior leadership like to have is information to help them manage the operation. So I always suggest, if you're going to be doing an internal audit and you kind of say, I'll just use a roof leak, for instance. If I have a roof up there and I can pay somebody twice a year to go up and look at the roof, they're not trying to sell me a roof, but they're going to look at the roof and tell me if there's any protrusions. Maybe that'll cost $4,000 or $5,000. And then if I actually have a roof leak, that may cost $50,000 to repair the roof. If I choose to do nothing and I have a recall, that could be a $10 million. So in your internal audits, if you can quantify it to an estimated cost of prevention, repair, and if we do nothing on your next mock recall, build a scenario around it and say, how much would that cost you if you had to recall that product? That's very valuable information to senior leadership. Also, another one is not having the right frequency. I've seen some companies do it one time a year as a deep dive into everything, and that's probably not the right frequency. The right frequency for most is twice a year in a 6-month look at it, and I'll talk about the hybrid audit in a little bit. Not training on all the requirements for the auditors at orientation into the audit function, and no refresher training is another mistake. Not having all the criteria included, for leaving out customer requirements, for instance. And here's another one. Most companies, the negative findings is around 90 to 95%. Why not have more positive findings in your internal audit? Your people are doing great things out there. Why not highlight it and celebrate the positives? If you bring that out into the public and make a big deal of it, how does that make the people feel? Makes them feel positive. Guess what that's going to do? Bring you more positives. So, build that into your internal audit to be looking for the positives. Also, look for preventive activities. Don't wait for a problem. Look for those areas that you can prevent a problem so that way you don't have a problem in the future. Other ones, they don't report on best practices. I've seen people where they celebrated a best practice, but it was not included in their internal audit. Why not have a section in there looking for best practices? And this is a big one for me, this next one. Not even looking at the wow factor. Now, some of you may be asking, what's a wow factor? Well, there's making a product that's okay, but there's making a product that somebody consumes it, it's like, wow, that's really good. Well, as an internal auditor, maybe you can help identify what are those things from supplier approval, what are those things as far as storage procedures, what are those things in manufacturing, setting up the equipment, belt speed, agitation, blend times, all those quality attributes all the way through. Can we start to measure the wow factor? And it could also include services, our connections with our supplier, our connections with our customers. You know, the customers have expectations and they have complaints. Is that getting back to the workers on the line? Is that getting back to the people that store the product? Is that getting back to the purchasing people? You've got to make sure the whole system works so that you can build that wow factor into it. Build it into your internal audit. Another one is not reporting all the requirements, all the laws. And don't forget the local laws and state laws. Those also need to be included in your internal audits. All your GFSI requirements. And now GFSI is coming out with a new document, new edition in March, which means all the other schemes, and they're going to have to update all of theirs. So anybody who's GFSI, in about a year, you'll be having new requirements. So you want to make sure those are updated. You may have some internal your company-specific requirements, or maybe your own brand requirements. Make sure all that's included. And of course, the auditors themselves, as they're doing the audit, they get interrupted from their office on normal job issues, as opposed to, hey, second in charge, you're now in charge of the office. I'm out doing an internal audit. It's like I'm not here. I'm an outside auditor here doing the audit. That's the way it should be focused on. Some places I've been to, they don't get the right auditor. They don't have the right skill set. Another big thing is that they don't have objectives for what they want the internal audit team to do. What's the whole purpose of doing internal audits? Do you want to change the working culture? Do you want to improve production efficiencies? Do you want to increase the wow factor? Build SMART objectives, and SMART is an acronym that's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So you want to build some objectives specifically for your internal audit team. And then, of course, not auditing all the essential areas. Sometimes things get left out. Not taking the audit findings seriously. Some sections and sometimes auditors don't take the findings seriously. Those are some mistakes I find some of the time. And probably 60 to 70% of the time, I don't see them even having an evaluation system for the internal auditors, to where they have feedback on how well they did with their audit, with their write-ups, with their description of the hazards and the risk and so forth. So those things need to be included. So you got to have an internal audit management system. Make sure you have those objectives established and make sure they're in alignment with what the company wants the internal audit tool to do for the company. Make sure you've got a good, competent manager of the internal audit system and have a good backup. Make sure they have clear roles and responsibilities and understand exactly what it is they need to do. Then you have to establish the actual procedures for conducting the audit. What are the methods we're going to use in the audit so that we can meet our objectives for this year or for next year or whatever? And then make sure you've got everything included in that audit criteria, and you assign a couple of people to keep that criteria current and up to date. And also include that wow factor. And you may need some help from the different departments so that you can actually quantify what that wow factor is. It's different in every facility, and it could be different for every product on the line. And then make sure you've got a good organized audit team. You've got representation across the board, maybe build a pool of auditors. And then make sure you have the rules for keeping things confidential. If you find somebody doing something wrong, you don't want the auditor blabbing it around to everybody in the plant. So you want to keep that confidential, and maybe you have to talk to that supervisor if it's really something bad. Make sure the security of your information is protected, and the health and safety of the auditor. Make sure that that is paramount, that they have the right safety equipment that they need if they're going to audit specific areas like going up onto the roof and so on and so forth. Then you establish the program, and you want to make sure that you have the right scope of the program, that everything's included. If you have a capital project going on, let's say a 2-year, I'm expanding onto the building 100,000 square feet, maybe you want to include in your criteria looking at that capital project over time. Are we meeting the requirements? Is it impacting food safety? Is it impacting quality? Are our contractors and our production people talking each day or with quality to look at the risk of what their operations are going to be on a daily basis? But your internal auditor should look at those things. And then you also have to think about, if I don't meet my objectives for my internal audit, what happens if we fail, not just the audit, but fail as an auditing team? What's the risk to our product? What's the risk? Because the FDA can look at your internal audits. Those are food safety documents. So you want anything you find, anything you document, you want to make sure that they're following up on it and having good corrective actions and so forth. Also, make sure you have the right resources. That the number one resource is time. You've got the time to do a good internal audit. You've set up a budget, so in case you need to do swabs, you need to do training, pull samples and send it off to the lab, whatever, a computer program. Make sure you have a budget for it, and that you've established a good audit reporting system, whether it's paper-based, computer-based, whatever. And then you want to make sure you do a good annual review. Make sure you've got the right team. You've got the diversity of the team, the right mix, the right background, the right technical expertise. If you've got radiological hazards, do you have somebody on the team that understands the radiological hazards? Either you get someone else on the team, or you reach out and get the appropriate training for the people that you have on the team. Make sure you have the right skills, the right competency, your evaluation systems in place and working. Somebody's updating our criteria and keeping it current, keeping it complete. So looking at the competency, is somebody reviewing as part of the evaluation the auditor behaviors and their skills? Are they asking good questions? Are they identifying the risk associated in the areas? Are they clearly describing it in their write-ups? Are they following the right principles and procedures? Do I need to get them more industry-specific training so that they understand our product and our process better? Keeping in mind that every internal auditor has a legal obligation to report findings. There is a legal aspect to that. And then, do they understand the hazards? Do they understand the risk? So we want to improve our auditor competency. So part of our program is we need to have continuing education. We want to make sure we're working on the audit protocols and procedures and the audit skills. Can they observe things? Your vision is kind of like a muscle. You can train yourself to be very observant, and you can notice things out of your peripheral vision if you work on it. Getting more information on the risk and the hazards, and learning about listeria, learning about salmonella, and so on and so forth. Maybe even have some training on critical thinking and problem solving, root cause analysis, which I find a lot of companies don't do right. And that may be a topic for another session in the future. If you have any changes to the system, changes to the process, new suppliers, new packaging companies, new packaging materials, new ingredients, processing aids, new products, new customers, new suppliers, you may want to build that into your system to say, the next internal audit, let's take a look at how we did that. Did we onboard that customer? Did we onboard that supplier? Did we bring in that new product, and did it cause any issues? What were the good, the bad, and the ugly associated with it? And if you have co-manufacturers, do you want to share information with that co-manufacturer of your findings because they're making your brand as well? And do they share what they're finding on your brand with you? Sometimes that's a good discussion to have. Again, if you have changes to your environment, maybe look at seasonal. In some locations, winter is very different than summer on inside for production. If you have a change in a high turnover of people, if you have change, you add a second shift, the internal auditor should be looking for the impacts of those things. So you want to include that on your internal audit. Then you want to manage all the outcomes and get your team together, review the entire report. And of course, during the audit, they need to look at the previous root cause analysis, the corrective actions. And then of course, if you've identified preventive actions, did the company actually implement those preventive actions? So you want to look at all those follow-ups after that. And then when you're done your report, who do we distribute it to? Who needs it? And you need to identify that and make sure they're actually getting the information so that they can follow it up. And then you want to keep your records for, in my opinion, I'm looking at probably 10 years or so, because if you do 2 audits a year, that's only 2 data points. So if you keep it for 5 years, that's 10 data points. And if you keep it electronically, electronic storage is real cheap these days. So a hybrid audit is let's say I do my GMP portion on a monthly basis. All the rest of my prerequisite programs I'm going to look at quarterly. And then once every 6 months, I'm going to take a deep dive and look at the systems and kind of cover everything else that I didn't cover monthly and quarterly. And most of that is, twice a year, most companies do. So here's some advice. Have a pool of auditors. Make sure you focus on having, a pool of auditors is, if I need 10 to do it, have 20. So that way you don't necessarily have a negative impact on production or quality or whoever. You can kind of pick and choose depending on the operations and special projects and all that's going on. You also should have in that pool one person that's trained that is auditing your internal audit function. That's their sole job. And then build into your audit more positive findings and teach your auditors what to look for positive. Teach them to look for preventive actions. Teach them to add in and get a value, a cost of the prevention, because the cheapest way to run a business is preventive. If you don't want to do that, then you wait for a problem to happen, then you have to fix it. That's a higher cost. If I don't do that, then I'm going to have a recall. If I have a recall, that's the highest cost. And you don't want to set it up to where your consumer or your customer is your warning system. Do you want to change your working culture? Well, build that into your internal audit. BRC has had that for a few years built in. SQF has that coming out with edition 9. Even the FDA is now looking at working culture. And it won't be long before the USDA is looking at that as well. So that's a coming thing. I would build it in to my internal audit. Make sure you have some good, specific, smart objectives. Make sure you establish a good budget. Make sure you have a formal, trained internal auditor. And then make sure, of course, my suggestion is to train your entire team so that way they're all on the same page. Another thing that I find a lot of companies don't do really well is start with an opening meeting and a closing meeting. Opening meeting, the senior leadership comes out and we're going to start to have this internal audit. Make sure that you open everything up. We look at everything. You tell us the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're not out to get you fired. We're not out to hurt anybody. We're here to improve our company. We're here to improve your job. And then, of course, have a closing meeting with, here's everything we found. Here's how we've met our objectives, or here's how we see changes in the working culture, and those kinds of things. And then, of course, celebrate the positives. You know, I always tell people when any auditor comes into your site, during the opening meeting, tell them, please, when you're walking around and dealing with it, find the positives. How does that make the people on the floor feel when an FDA inspector, a USDA inspector pointed out the positive, or a customer comes in and points out the positive? Your internal auditor points out the positive, and now you're going to celebrate all your positives. It's going to make them feel good, and everybody else around them is going to step up their game. And that's what you want. You want to improve the entire system. And the internal auditing tool can help you do that. So I get right back to it. If you put all of this together and you identify everything in your process, you really want to identify that wow factor, which incorporates all of this. Because if you can become the wow to your customer, you're going to have repeat business. Word of mouth will spread, and then other people will want to do business with you because you figured out the wow factor. But it all starts with that internal audit. And it's such an important tool that you have to be able to pull it together and get your team trained. And there's lots of little parts and pieces there. But you gotta, it all starts with the beginning of, putting that team together and getting the criteria and following all the tips that I put in there. There's a lot of information that I put out there. To let you know, we do have a class. Merieux has one in March 10th and 11th. It's 2 days here in Chicago. Since it's a public course, I have some scenarios. There's like 6 exercises. If I teach it in a plant, I actually have the people go out into the facility and do a mini internal audit. And we talk about all of these things. I show them how to write it up, show them how to communicate it to senior leadership, show them how to do the wow factor, build, the quality into it. We cover all of that. So I covered an awful lot of stuff here, and I'd like to turn it back over to Brian. So we've got a little bit of time here. We can get some questions. I think that would be a good point right now.
I think that would be great. So first, wow, lots of good stuff. Thank you, Jeff. Definitely appreciate everything you packed into that time, but we do have a lot of questions. So as we noted in the beginning, a couple of things. One, Jeff has been kind enough to make the deck available and the reporting. So yes, we will be getting those out in the next day or two. But we're going to do our best to dig into some of the Q&A that we have right now. Definitely encourage you. I'm going to leave up for a moment here Jeff's email address, and the link will include as well for their upcoming training, but there's obviously a lot more they do as well. So Jeff, are you stretched out? You're ready? You're warmed up? I'm gonna do my best to kind of pick through some of these that are applicable to as many people as possible and go from there. So
I'm ready to go.
All right. I thought this was one of the very first questions. I think it's a great one. You touched on mistakes, but this question is, what are some of the most common overlooked items skipped during an internal audit? Is there anything, I think you covered some of that in the mistakes. Is there anything you would add specifically about items you see skipped often?
Things that they miss during the audit?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, again, there's a lot of things that I see across the system that they tend to miss. They leave out criteria. Most often it's they don't have all the customer requirements built into the audit. Mm-hmm. They don't have the laws written into their SOPs. So when you go through your SOPs, at the end of it, you should have your references. Where does that requirement come from? Does that come from 21 CFR? Does it come from 9 CFR? Does it come from just the GFSI, SQF code? Does it come from the BRC code? And then does it come from a certain customer? I don't see a lot of that associated. Another thing that's really big is a disconnect between what's in the procedure, what is in the training, and what people are actually doing on the floor. Sure. As an internal auditor, you have to evaluate that process and to make sure it's all in alignment. You want to, make sure that it's clearly written in the procedure. And if you have a procedure that's 25 pages, nobody's going to read that except whoever wrote it and maybe an auditor. The best I've seen is a procedure that is actually written by the people on the floor and then verified as meeting all the requirements by a supervisor and QA. But it's a flow diagram. Step 1, you do this. Step 2, you do that, and kind of goes through the flow diagram. But it's put together by the people that are actually going to do it.
Right.
So those are kind of the top things that I see.
Okay, good. Question here about from Tony on how would you audit your traceability program outside of the recall system?
I would want to challenge the system. One thing that I do is I come up with a scenario and I'll walk into a facility and I say, your glove manufacturer just came to you and said, we make gloves for other industries and we inadvertently put the wrong chemical in this glove and of these lot numbers that came to you. And we need you to, we're recalling those gloves, and the chemical that's in those gloves tends to come out of those gloves. So if you've touched food with it, you might need to recall that product. So then you start to see people sweat bullets and like say, oh crap, I can't do that. Sleeve guards, same way. It's coming up with those things that you can test the system. As an auditor, you can pick an item, pick an ingredient, pick a packaging material, and just say, okay, prove to me where you got this from, and prove to me where it went, where it went to, where did you ship it to. If everybody's really being mad at you that day, you can pick an item like flour that comes in the flour bin. That would really upset them. Or you could pick something very easy like a finished product, just depending. But you want to do it differently, a different item, maybe a processing aid even, just to see how your system works, and you're not looking for them to actually trace it all the way with all the documentation. You want to show the capability that the information and the data is there and it's available to get to. So that you can actually do the traceability.
No, that's great, Tony. Hopefully that was helpful. I've got a few here, Jeff. I'm going to try and summarize, but they're really talking about when you're selecting your team, which you covered in great detail. Can you give any advice on the size and the makeup of that? Is there a ratio that you think? You mentioned if you need 10, do 20, but how do you arrive at the 10 or the 20? Is it a ratio to department size, type of industry, size of plant? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's kind of got all of it. You have to look at risk first. And then, of course, the size of the operation, how many lines, how many employees. You want to interview around 10% of your employees. So you've got to have people to do that. I've got how many different departments do I have? Because I have to include everything in the scope. So do I have enough people that can go out and, if I'm going to split this up over 6 months, I may not need as many auditors. But if I'm going to do it, say, in 2 months, I may need a larger group of auditors to be able to hit it all within 3 or 4 days. Or if I'm going to split it out to where these 10 auditors can do 2 days in the first month, 3 days in the second month, and, split it up over a period of time, I want to look at, what they call a full-time equivalent, how many hours it takes to do these audits, to write up things, to point out all the positives, the best practices, preventive actions, to put it all in a report, to be able to describe the risk. If I want them to pull samples, if I want them to do swabs, doing the interviews and all that, I want to add up all that time to say how many full-time equivalents is that, and then do I want it in that number of people? So let's say that all adds up to 10. And then I need to have a larger pool that I can swap people in and out, because let's say one department only has 4 people and I don't want to keep pulling somebody out of that department every time I do an internal audit.
Right.
So I want to be able to have a pool to pick from. And if I've got a special project, R&D's got a big customer project going on for this month, maybe I can use them during the next audit, but not during this audit. So you want to build a buffer system for you to give you the flexibility to be able to deal with everything and look at everything. But it's based on size and scope and complexity and number of employees and the risk.
Okay, that's good. I think that gives a nice framework, and I think some of so for those of you that ask those questions, hopefully that gives you a nice starter kit, and I think it applies whether you're big or small, which is where some of the questions came in. One question I think that's probably near and dear to your heart is about frequency of training. So Ms. Sreen, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, asked what should be the training frequency for your internal auditors?
Well, at first you got to do the orientation. And then you should, if you're going to do, let's say, 2 audits a year, and I'm taking the pool of auditors in, and I'm not using everybody for this first year, then during the second year, I'm going to pull those people back in. I need to give them just-in-time refresher training so that they're ready to do those audits for the second year. But I would probably do a different topic once every 6 months. One topic might be critical thinking, another one might be descriptive writing, another one might be on hazards. We're going to have a session, and just do like an hour session if it's salmonella, listeria. A lot of people don't know that listeria can grow down to 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that can be a problem if you have a freezer, if you have, a cooling tunnel and those kinds of things. So they need to have that understanding of the hazards and the risk associated with what's on their hazard analysis.
Okay.
So that would be my first, and again, they can get with me if they have specific questions on it, and I can help them build a good frequency for that.
Perfect. That's great. Question from Todd is: are more companies moving toward digital audits or paper records still commonly used, or what kind of trends are you seeing?
The larger companies have the resources that they're going to more digital. Some of the medium companies are doing that, but I would say still the majority of medium to small companies really don't have the resources, and it's pretty much all paper-based. Some companies will only have one auditor, and they don't really want to put in a second or third auditor because they don't want to pull people from production. And that's where you need to really change the mindset of senior leadership to see so that they can understand what the audit can do for them. And once they understand that, then they are willing to invest in that.
That's an important point, and I'll add to that, since it's something we see in here every day. I think you're on the right track there. We're definitely seeing a trend both for the mid market and larger companies as well, but it's definitely more accessible for everybody. I think, to your point, once the value is understood and conveyed internally, there's a lot of great technology to support you out there. So.
And it actually saves them money if they go that route.
Huge amount. It makes impacts in other areas of the business, and that's usually how you build that business case. That might be a good topic for another time. Someone else asked also about the budget. Is there anything else budget-wise that you, I'm trying to find the question here, elaborate on establishing the budget criteria? Is there other things you would suggest they factor into that?
Well, the number one is time. Budget in the time and make sure the supervisors and leaders fully support that. But you need a budget. So if you want a computer system, get the budget for that computer system. Again, supplies, equipment. So if you need, safety gear for it, if you need pH test strips, if you need thermometers, you need a pH meter. What is it you need to be able to follow through with that budget?
That's great. I've saved this question because it came in from a few people, and I love the term, and you lit up as you talked about it, the wow factor. So there's a few people that asked, can you elaborate on it? One was asking, how do you incorporate this into the process? Like, is it part of actually the documents and tools you create for the auditor? So I want to just allow you a moment here to share a little bit more about your thoughts on the wow factor. That caught people's attention for sure.
Yeah, the wow factor is really looking at both food safety and quality across the board in every department in every area, but it's going to be different for every facility and different for every product and production line. So it could be part of it is buying the right materials, getting the right packaging, and identifying those specific things that might have a negative impact on our process and our product all the way through the process. Again, it's the setting up of the equipment, making sure the people know what the difference is with just a normal run and a, wow, we're really making great product here. But I would really have to get with people one-on-one on that one, because they can explain the product and then I can give them specific things that they can do all the way through their process. But it's also in your customer service to your people.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, that's a good segue to kind of the wrap up here. So first, Jeff, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I took note of 2, 3 at least more topics that hopefully we can bring you back for. But this was fantastic content, and really appreciate you sharing that with everybody today.
No problem.
For everybody else, again, we'll get a link to Jeff's contact information on their upcoming training, along with the Merieux website, which has a whole lot more great content and resources. We also have on the screen, safetychain.com, we have a resources tab. You'll be able to watch the replay there shortly, as well as download the slides. And we also have our whole library of these beyond compliance. So lots of other great topics like this. We also have all of them posted on YouTube, so you can watch them at your leisure. And of course, if there's any interest in learning about how we help on the technology side, you want to digitize this whole audit process, we would certainly love an opportunity to share how we can help as well. So with that, thank you everybody for making time. Thank you for the great work you all do out there in the food safety and quality community. Jeff, thank you, and Merieux for the partnership in putting this together. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody next month.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.